Good afternoon, dear audience, and welcome to DIIS. It's being live streamed, so I have to move into the middle of the stage. I'm being told. My name is Jessica Larsen. I'm a senior researcher here at the Danish Institute for International Studies.
And my name is Thomas Roslyng Olesen. I'm head of the Maritime Research Alliance, and we're happy to welcome you here to today's session on maritime security in the Arctic. The Arctic area is an area that has gained increased attention, especially in the past decade. The ice is melting, and this has led to new navigational and operational conditions, and is gradually leading to this in the Arctic area, which has both commercial and geopolitical consequences. And this is what we are going to delve into at today's event, where we will look into the geopolitical, the legal, and the commercial implications of this development. And in order to do this, we have invited some experts in the area. First, Jessica Larsen will be setting the scene with a short introduction to the topic. And Jessica is a senior researcher here at the Danish Institute for International Studies. She has an expertise in maritime security issues, and she's also co-organizer of this event together with us from Maritime Research Alliance. Then we have Lin Alexandra Mortensgaard, who will introduce the geopolitical aspects. Lin is a PhD fellow here at the Danish Institute for International Studies. She has an expertise in how the changing climate affects geopolitics in the Arctic. After this, we will look into the legal part. Here we have Stella Abbersmeyer, who will introduce us to the legal aspects. Stella is a PhD fellow at the University of Copenhagen at the Center for Climate Change, Law and Governance at the Faculty of Law. And finally, we have Qvist Frederiksen, who will introduce the more economic and commercial aspects of the ongoing development. And Mads is the executive director of the Arctic Economic Council. And the Arctic Economic Council is an independent organization that facilitates Arctic business-to-business activities and economic development in the Arctic. So we kind of have specific experts that will cover the different areas today. After the presentations, we will have 30 minutes of Q&A facilitated by Jessica. And with these words, I think that I will just give the floor to you, Jessica. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Thomas. Can you all hear me well? Yes, good. Okay, so personally, I'm very excited about this seminar today. So we've all heard that great power rivalry has come to the Arctic. We've all heard that the ice is melting at the poles. And with that comes potential new shipping routes. But what does it actually mean? How is it actually playing out at this very early stage? And what are the consequences, both politically, legally, and economically? That's what we're going to unpack today. As Thomas just said, I'm Jessica Larsen, senior researcher here at DIIS, working on maritime security and the freedom of navigation, or maybe I should say maritime insecurity and the obstructions to the freedom of navigation. For instance, by the piracy and by the recent Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, and increasingly also due to geoeconomic geopolitical tensions in various maritime domains. So I will be chairing today's event, and I'll begin by just saying two words about the background. Maritime security generally as a topic is increasingly gaining traction in the media, among politicians and decision makers, because the freedom of navigation is so fundamental to the global economy and our global supply chain security, and naturally also very important for Denmark as a seafaring nation. There's an interesting study about the UN Security Council by Brian Wilson, who has shown that the study is some years old now, but it shows that more UN Security Council resolutions were passed about maritime security between 2008 and 2018 than since the inception of the Security Council until 2007. So this is an interesting, but of course also very generalized indication that maritime security is gaining increased attention in the last years. But during this period from 2008 to 2018, much of the attention has been on piracy, first in East Africa and then in West African waters. Denmark is very much involved in these maritime domains and remains so. But in the last 5 to 10 years, we are seeing a change. We're seeing increasing great power rivalry and also geopolitics driving foreign policy. And this tension is also taking to the sea. For example, in the South China Sea and in the Strait of Hormuz with obstructions to the freedom of navigation. I normally use the image of geopolitics spreading like rings in the water. And I think the maritime domain that we're going to talk about today is definitely a case in point. To qualify this increasing debate on maritime security, the Maritime Research Alliance and DIIS are organizing a row of seminars. This one is the second. The first one was held in June, and it was about the South China Sea and Chinese interventions and power projection there. You can find it on DIIS DK under events, or go to my page, Jessica Larsen, and you can find the link there. The third seminar will be held in January about the Baltic Sea, geopolitics and maritime security in the Baltic in January 2025, so stay tuned. But for now, we have a great lineup of speakers to take us through the situation in the Arctic, and we start with Lin on the geopolitics. So Lin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Should I stand here?
You can stand here if you want.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. As was said, my name is Lin Mortensgaard, and I'm a PhD candidate here at DIIS. And I'm going to sort of take on the geopolitical hat today and speak from the most security politics oriented angle. So I'll try to set the scene in kind of a macro perspective, and hopefully as a platform which can be helpful also for the two other perspectives. So I think it's clear that the US, China, and to some extent Russia see themselves as being in geopolitical competition, and this is sort of a prism that all three of them see world politics, international politics through. And this kind of competitive state or competitive modus has also entered the Arctic region, I think it's fair to say. And this started before the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So that's kind of the very broad helicopter view of things. But I want actually to focus on something much more specific and tangible, the icebreaker. Of course, you know, the icebreaker is a highly specialized vessel which has kind of the core purpose of breaking ice, breaking paths through the ice in the Arctic. And I think it's relevant to kind of look at this very particular technology or vessel, not just because this seminar is about maritime security, but also because I think the icebreaker actually encapsulates some key geopolitical dynamics ongoing in the Arctic. So we're seeing increasing attention to icebreaker construction, number of icebreakers, the kind of interest in acquiring new icebreakers, and I think this shows that despite climate change, of course, being very dramatic in the Arctic region, sea ice specifically, and also other kinds of ice, but sea ice in this case is still a factor to be reckoned with in the Arctic. So we all know that Arctic sea ice is decreasing. That's kind of the overall trend. It's decreasing in extent and in thickness, and we had a sea ice minimum in 2012. But this kind of overall decreasing trend doesn't mean that sea ice is decreasing in any in a way that's kind of easily predictable or dependable as forecasts for navigation. And this is one of the reasons why institutions like the DMI, Danish Meteorological Institute, and also Arctic Command in Nuuk on a daily basis monitor sea ice around Greenland. And I have two contrasting examples to do with icebreakers that actually show this kind of that sea ice is not really predictable in a sense that's useful for navigation. The first one is the maiden voyage of an icebreaker called the Arctica, which was the first of one of a number of new Russian icebreakers, very powerful icebreakers. And the Arctica set out in September 2020 on its maiden voyage, its test voyage. And during this trip, it was meant to find sea ice to kind of test its icebreaking capabilities. And the problem was that it couldn't really find sea ice thick enough to actually, be certified and test its icebreaking abilities. So I think that example stands in contrast to another situation less than a year later in, I think, November 2021, when all of a sudden 20 commercial ships got stuck in the Northern Sea route because of early onset freeze in this part of the Arctic. So this shows that sea ice is not exactly predictable, and it also shows that there's still a need for icebreaking and all the range of different tasks that icebreakers do, creating access to ports, paving the way for other vessels, scientific projects, and so on. And of course, it also shows that the demand for icebreaking can be quite sudden. The second thing I think we can learn about maritime security in the Arctic from the icebreaker is that security dynamics in the Arctic is not only about missiles, submarines, aircraft carriers, all these kind of hard security, big guns kind of things. It's also about technologies, infrastructure, and competences which are specifically tailored to the Arctic, Arctic conditions, Arctic developments as they happen in the Arctic, and always at the mercy of the Arctic climate and changing weather. So I think icebreakers epitomize how Arctic maritime navigation, whether it's commercial, military, scientific, civilian, that happens under conditions which cannot be directly compared to non-Arctic conditions in other regions of the world. And the broader point here is that this dynamic goes for pretty much all aspects of Arctic geopolitics and security dynamics developments in the region. You need knowledge and expertise to be able to operate in the Arctic, whether it's through humans, be it scientists or military forces, or whether it's with technologies such as ships, weapon systems, scientific equipment. So security dynamics in the Arctic are not only about missiles, submarines, and aircraft carriers, but of course, and this is my third point that we can learn from icebreakers, it's also about all these things, these hard security questions. So we see increasingly that kind of power politics, alliance politics, competition is entering the Arctic. And at this moment, I think in northern Norway, there are two different carrier groups, one American and one British, sailing around. So Arctic geopolitics and maritime security is very much also about these dynamics. And we see how icebreakers are increasingly the focus of and part of this conversation also among in defense circles, among politicians, in the media, and also in academic debates about so-called hard security questions. And I think this increasing focus on icebreakers and icebreaking capabilities shows this kind of competitive state that I referred to in the beginning. Non-Arctic dynamics, non-Arctic competition is entering the region and sort of overlaying everything that's going on, or being kind of a running headline through which all kinds of other developments and technologies are understood. And it's only, I would say, through a competitive or conflictual lens that you can that icebreakers suddenly come to take on new meaning as a security technology. It's only by understanding the world through this kind of competitive lens that the icebreaker is no longer just a civilian vessel. And I've brought some examples to show this shift in the meaning and the role of icebreakers in the Arctic region, and how we understand and interpret icebreakers. So the first is from the Mosaic expedition, which you might have heard about. It was a big scientific expedition, international expedition, where an icebreaker was purposefully lodged in the middle of the Arctic Ocean and left there for a year, from 2019 to 2020, to kind of drift through the Arctic Ocean and monitor sea ice movement. And part of this expedition was a supporting system of icebreakers. In this picture, it's a Russian icebreaker. I think there's also a Chinese icebreaker involved. And this example shows that not that long ago, icebreaking was actually a way to cooperate in the Arctic through science, but also very much through the icebreaker as a vessel, as a scientific vessel. If we fast forward to today, it looks quite different. The conversation and the reporting that we're seeing about icebreakers has taken on a very different character. So this is from the Barents Observer, and this is an article about a Chinese icebreaker making a port call in Murmansk in Russia. And the article is about how this is a symbol or an indication of increasing Russian-Chinese cooperation in the Arctic, and also about how Chinese icebreaking is seen as dual use. So it's not just for civilian data collection and scientific projects, it's also potentially for military purposes. Second example is from High North News, and I think this is speaking directly to this idea of like an icebreaker gap, which is increasingly part of the narrative or the rhetoric, especially in the US, where there is a growing concern with the number of US icebreakers being, much less than the number of Russian icebreakers. And this is about how these new US icebreakers, which have been, sanctioned by Congress, are even more delayed than they were before. And this is, of course, a really big problem because Russia keeps kind of spitting icebreakers out. So the icebreaker becomes a very kind of tangible way to compete in the Arctic through this particular technology. And then the last one, I think, is also the most interesting, or a new perspective for me at least. So Finland, Canada, and the US have made a partnership and agreed to build icebreakers together for the Arctic. And as it says in the article, this partnership was agreed on the sidelines of the NATO summit in Washington. So I think this is not a criticism of the reporting, it's just to show how kind of the meaning and the narrative of icebreakers is shifting and has been shifting. And I think it shows that the arguments used to justify new icebreakers, the kind of the reasoning behind the icebreaker is very much becoming part of alliance politics, part of competition, a parameter in this competition, and it's a way to show presence in the Arctic, and with this presence to kind of gain influence as a state that is competing in the Arctic. And we also see this in the kind of in the dual use concerns with icebreakers, that suddenly there is icebreakers are not just for scientific purposes or civilian purposes, commercial purposes. They are by definition also potentially for military purposes. So we see in this way that icebreakers, seemingly a civilian vessel, are very clearly becoming part of alliance politics and a part of great power competition as it asserts itself increasingly in the Arctic. So to conclude, and also perhaps bring Denmark and Greenland a little bit into the conversation, this is not my elevator pitch for a Danish Greenlandic icebreaker construction program, not at all. What I hope to kind of have shown is that through the example of the icebreaker, to discuss maritime security in the Arctic is to acknowledge, I think, these three specific aspects of most or perhaps any geopolitical dynamic in the Arctic region today. So first of all, that climate change affects whatever we are talking about, and it does so in a non-linear and difficult to predict way. Secondly, also when it comes to maritime security in the Arctic, knowledge and experience with local conditions matter tremendously, and you cannot discount or sideline these experiences and this knowledge. And finally, the competition between the US, China, and Russia is increasingly part of all kinds of security dynamics in the region, also maritime security. This means that all technologies, initiatives, and so on are automatically understood potentially as dual use and as part of this competition. That goes for icebreakers, that goes for science, and I think also resource exploration, and a number of other economic exploits. I'm sure Mads can say more about that. And of course, this going back to this dual use, I think it's interesting to note that when we're talking about defense agreement negotiations between Denmark and Greenland, or discussions among Danish politicians, dual use is of course a request or a promise and a good thing. But as soon as we look at less friendly states, dual use becomes, also when it comes to icebreakers, an accusation or a warning. So I think with that, I'll just conclude by saying that maritime security in an Arctic context is about a very broad range of tasks. I haven't mentioned search and rescue, but that's of course very important as well. But whatever we are talking about, more specifically, I think we should remember these three things, because they are present as factors or conditions of whichever part of Arctic maritime security we're talking about. And with that, hopefully broad start, I will leave it to the legal perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Lin, for bringing to our attention this fascinating case. Stella, the floor is yours.
Yes, I'll just wait for the setup. Meanwhile, can you hear me well with the microphone? Yes? Yes? Hello, hello, test. Okay, perfect, thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you so much for creating this event and inviting me to talk. I'm very happy to talk about my research today, which is basically a part of my PhD thesis, which is specifically on the regulation of black carbon emissions from Arctic shipping. So yeah, I'll try to bring in the legal perspective a little bit today. And yeah, I'm very happy because I submitted my PhD about a month ago, and now I have all of the time to present my findings. So I'm very happy to be here and discuss. So just to start with some background on Arctic shipping. So first of all, it should be noted in general that the shipping sector is a huge contributor to climate change. For those of you that don't know, shipping emissions contribute about 3% of global GHGs. And within the past decades, shipping has increased tremendously worldwide, but also specifically in the Arctic region. So you can see here that there has already been an increase of 37% of shipping activities in the Arctic between 2013 and 2023, and that number is also expected to continue to rise. And the reason for that increase specifically in Arctic shipping is, of course, the opening up of the new shipping routes due to climate change and the melting of the Arctic snow and sea ice. So here I've just put an overview or the usual map showing the three main shipping routes. So you can see the Northern Sea route in red, which goes along Russia and Norway. Then you can see the Northwest Passage along Canada and the US coastline, and then the transpolar route, which would go through the pole when accessible. But of course, there are different levels of accessibility and feasibility of the different routes, and the Northern Sea route, the red one, is right now being seen by most authors as the most accessible and feasible route for Arctic shipping. The reason for this increased interest in Arctic shipping is, of course, that ships save time and therefore also potentially money when they take these routes, as they can be much shorter, kind of hopping over the pole instead of going all the way around the globe, such as, for example, through the Suez Canal. But this increase in Arctic shipping is quite problematic from a climate standpoint, specifically in connection to black carbon. So black carbon is the small black particle that is emitted when ships burn heavy fuel oil, which is an oil that's commonly used by big ships operating in the Arctic. And I've put a picture up here of heavy fuel oil, so how it looks like. And as you can see, it's not the cleanest oil, but it is the cheapest oil. So that is why it's also very commonly used. And the issue with black carbon is that it's a very potent climate forcer, because even though it only stays in the atmosphere for a very short period of time, so about 1 or 2 weeks, during this time it has very strong climate forcing effects. First of all, when it is emitted, the airborne black carbon absorbs the sunlight and immediately heats the atmosphere. But then again, when it lands on snow and ice, it again, has a heating effect because it actually reduces the albedo effect, as we now have a black cover on the white snow surface. And that is also why black carbon effects are about 7 to 10 times greater in the Arctic than in other areas of the world, such as, for example, if it were to be emitted here or in the Mediterranean, because most ships operate close to snow-covered areas. And all of this is quite concerning because black carbon emissions from Arctic shipping have already increased by 85% between 2015 and 2019, and under a business as usual scenario are also expected to continue to grow. So that's why reducing or putting a regulation on black carbon emissions can be seen as a kind of quick and easy reduction potential, especially because, like I said, black carbon remains in the atmosphere for such a short period of time. So if we were to put regulation, that regulation would have an almost immediate effect. But if we look at what's happening on the regulatory level, so in the legal landscape, well, I've put an overview of the legal landscape here. You can see that we have a lot of different regimes that could and do cover black carbon to a certain extent. We have the International Climate Change regime of the UNFCCC, that of the International Maritime Organization. We have also the Arctic Council that has been quite active on black carbon. And then we have some other regimes, such as, for example, the Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution regime and more regional and local regimes. I won't go too much into each regime today. It's quite technical, and but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A in case there are some legal questions. So I'll just focus on the IMO for now, because that is where most of the regulation on black carbon is developing and where it's been discussed since 2011. So just for some background on the IMO is the UN Specialized Agency for International Shipping. It's an international organization that has 175 member states and also a lot of non-state actors present. It regulates matters relating to safety and security and prevention of pollution from ships. I've just put the structure up here of the IMO. Most importantly, the work on black carbon and heavy fuel oil is being conducted in the Marine Environmental Protection Committee and its subcommittee on pollution prevention and response. And also a crucial aspect is that the IMO usually tries to take decisions by consensus, so it usually tries to avoid any votings, which can be quite difficult as you have 175 states. So usually when the chair is in the process of finding a consensus, the consensus that is agreed upon sometimes or usually might be the lowest common denominator that is found. Regarding the regulation of black carbon and heavy fuel oil at the IMO, we have a couple of relevant documents stemming from the MEPC. We have some guidelines, best practices, and so on, but these are soft law documents. They don't have any legally binding force, and until now have not shown any change in behavior. We also do have an international treaty. We have MARPOL, so the International Convention for Prevention of Pollution from Ships, where we have two relevant annexes, so Annex 1 on oil pollution and Annex 6 on air pollution. Under Annex 1 on oil pollution, recently an amendment came into force, which actually does contain a ban on heavy fuel oil in the Arctic. But unfortunately, that amendment is rather weak because it essentially delays real effective measures until 2029 because it contains many waivers and exemptions until then. And of course, we need to have regulation sooner rather than later. And then also Annex 6, we have a recent resolution that came into force, which focuses on a fuel switch away from heavy fuel oil to distillate fuels. But unfortunately, that's just a voluntary resolution. So again, we don't have legally binding force there. So of course, then the question that arises is why do we have this regulatory gap? Why do we have such slow progress? Also considering that basically black carbon has been on the agenda of the IMO since 2011, and many of the states that in 2015 decided to limit global warming to a 1.5 degree temperature increase are also sitting at the IMO, and this would be a kind of low-hanging fruit. So essentially what I ask in my PhD are what are the barriers to advancing in the regulation? In my PhD specifically, I focus on the barriers for non-state actors, so that is something that is my theoretical focus there. But I also have a lot of data on barriers that are encountered or that have to do with states, and one of them is actually geopolitics, so that's what I would just like to address now. Because one of the big issues that came up in the interviews that I conducted to find out what the barriers are is the situation of Russia's war in Ukraine and how that actually, so these geopolitics affect the regulation, so how that affects the law from not developing. So one of the big barriers that surfaced from the interviews that I conducted was that the pause of the Arctic Council work, which even though it now has resumed almost completely, actually meant that all of the projects on black carbon also were halted, which also meant that cooperation on this topic was no longer possible with Russia. And as Russia makes up 50% of the Arctic, that has been seen as quite difficult. And as one interviewee noted, how can you make a decision with only 7 at the table? In that connection, it was also often noted that there is insufficient institutional coordination because actually the Arctic Council has done quite a lot of work on black carbon. They have come up with reports, guidelines, their own goals, and so on. But all of this knowledge doesn't necessarily find its way into the IMO, where regulation is developing. So that was another barrier. And then lastly, another barrier that came up was that also in the IMO itself, it's quite difficult because there is not enough collaboration with Russia happening. So yeah, here the interviewers noted that Russia has become even more volatile, aggressive, and non-cooperative in the IMO on black carbon discussions. And even if they said something that made sense, we couldn't support it. And lastly, that they are supported by China and other pro-nationalist governments at the expense of global conversations. So again, yeah, this is a barrier for advancing in black carbon regulation at the IMO, also because Russia is, of course, an important Arctic state. So when the chair is trying to find a consensus on black carbon matters in the IMO, it will look to Russia to see if that consensus has found. So yeah, that was just interesting to see that actually geopolitics and security issues play a big role also in furthering or not furthering regulation. And basically what I do in my PhD then is that I take the different barriers and I say, okay, now that we have identified these barriers, what are the pathways or the opportunities that we can take to overcome these barriers? And one thing that, of course, would make sense would be to strengthen institutional coordination between the relevant regimes and institutions that I already mentioned. So one way of doing this would be to strengthen the observer role of the IMO to the Arctic Council, because the IMO is actually an observer to the Arctic Council, so that de facto role could be strengthened. On the other hand, or on the other side, the role of PAIM, or the expertise and the people that attend PAIM meetings, so PAIM is a working group of the Arctic Council, could be better integrated into the IMO itself, so to make sure that we have that knowledge and the same people attending PAIM that also go to the IMO. Because yes, actually a lot of these people work in silos, so the IMO delegates have no idea what's going on with the Arctic Council. They come from different ministries often in their national delegations, so that is something that could perhaps be ameliorated. And then I also thought that perhaps to ensure that information is shared better, something akin to a joint liaison group could be established between the different secretariats of the different relevant institutions. So there we could put together the secretariats of the Arctic Council, the IMO, the UNFCCC, and also the air pollution regime. And another possibility would be to create something like a joint work program to basically conduct operations jointly, to conduct them on the ground and so on between the different institutions. Apart from that, so apart from the institutional level, it would also be a possibility or a pathway to form and act as entrepreneurs for change. So that is a term that is often used in the literature for actors who are specifically pushing for advancing regulations in international fora. So they could, for example, offer counsel to other actors and provide logistics, financial support, technical expertise, and so on, and also a platform for other actors which, for example, don't have a seat at the IMO, such as certain groups of indigenous peoples. And then lastly, there's also a pathway for pro and contra change alliances. So right now we have a lot of environmental NGOs that are pushing for regulatory change on black carbon emissions in the IMO. So we could say we have a kind of pro-change alliance of these different NGOs. But what I actually found in my research, and also what has been already shown in the literature and other regimes, is that it's much stronger for an alliance to be formed, and their influence can be much stronger if they're not formed in a homogeneous manner, so not just the environmental NGOs, but if they try to collaborate with key states where they can collaborate on key issues such as black carbon, and also industry actors, so that they kind of, more heterogeneous and can affect greater change. And on the other side, there's of course an opportunity to avoid contra-change alliances, such as in this case Russia and China, basically by increasing interactions with these actors, entering into dialogue, and also creating incentive for them, or showing incentives for them to following with this pathway, and also perhaps work with their reputation in an international level. So yes, that was basically what I finished with, and in my PhD I then have a summary of the different pathways which I think actors should follow. I structure them around pathways for states and non-state actors. So if you're interested after my PhD defense in December, I'm also happy to share that. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stella, and hey, congratulations on submitting your PhD. Good work. Mads, we're ready for your presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, so what we just heard is actually also related to business as well. So that was just announced last week that Russia will, in collaboration with India, buy icebreakers and to compete against China. So this geopolitical insecurity. So now they will suddenly buy icebreakers from India. That's big business. And heavy fuel oil ban started on July 1st with a transition period until 29. But the heavy fuel oil ban actually was criticized by some local shipping industries in the Arctic because they felt they was hurting the local communities, which I think is an interesting story. It was supported by Danish industry, Danish shipping, for example. It was supported obviously by the IMO that implemented it. But there's this whole debate about what about the local communities and the just transition, which is also just shows the complexity of the different things and how it's all related to people and also to economies, because that's related, obviously. So just 90% of the things you see in this room has been transported on the ocean. So that's just to say, it's important what we're going to talk about. Everything you see around you has been at some point be in the oceans. And most of us in this world, we live in the Northern Hemisphere. And if you look at the Arctic, we are really an ocean surrounded by land. So instead of being a land surrounded by the ocean, the Arctic is an ocean surrounded by land. And Arctic business has always been done. What you see here are the trading routes from the year 985, when the Vikings went out from Norway to Iceland over to Greenland. And they did this not because of tourism necessarily, but because of trade. They wanted to sell narwhal tusks into European parliaments. So we have been sailing in the Arctic, for thousands of years. Just to say it's not new, but it's definitely increasing, as we will see. And also, we talked about climate change. This is a map of, they took ship logs from the 18th and 19th century, and they were trading the different maps. So what you see here, this is before the Panama and Suez Canal is being constructed. And then when the Panama and Suez Canal gets constructed, suddenly sea paths or sea routes are changing. And you could say with climate change, suddenly there is a new ocean opening up and there is a new route opening up. We also have a drought at the Panama Canal, which is going to change shipping. We have the Houthis attacking ships, so that means that some ships are going either further south or further north. But just to say, shipping routes are changing all the time. We already saw this map, so I will just go to the next part, which is there's different kinds of shipping in the Arctic. So one is destinational shipping. So this is where ships sail to the Arctic, perform some activity, unloading their goods, and then they sail south again. We see quite a lot. This is something you order. You sit in Nuuk in Greenland, you order it, it goes on a container, and it goes up to Greenland. So this is one form of shipping, destinational shipping. Then there's the intra-Arctic transport. So as it states, a voyage of marine activities that stays within the general Arctic region and links two or more Arctic states. Eimskip going over to Greenland, for example. There's the trans-Arctic transportation and navigation voyages. So this is the new thing. This is not as big right now. So this is voyages taken across the Arctic Ocean from the Pacific to the Atlantic or vice versa. Some organizations are fighting to ban this, for example, because it doesn't provide local value necessarily from the communities. And then cabotage, just to conduct trade or engage marine transportation in coastal waters between ports within the Arctic state, which is not the biggest one, but I'll go on. So throughout the Arctic region, if you look what they have in common from, the Arctic is 8 Arctic states, and what do they have in common? And the economies have 3 things in common generally. One is seafood. 98% of export from Greenland is fish. Second largest export from Norway is fish. The Vikings actually used to trade seafood as well. So that is one thing that is being shipped. As we see in this one from Payne, we heard about earlier. This is the kind of ships that are sailing in the Arctic over the past 10 years. And the big pillars all the way on the right, that's fishing vessels. Just to put it into context, then you got general cargo and so on. And just to follow up on Lin's good comment to say everything is security and everything is business and everything is related. This is from my hometown of Tromsø, well above the Arctic Circle. This is a Russian fishing vessel that docks outside to unload their fish. This still happens in 3 ports in Norway, where they also go and get service, their LNG carriers, and they also fish in the region. So even though we have very strict regulations, because of Norway and Russia's long history around fisheries, we still have Russian fishing vessels docking in ports in Norway at the moment. So fish is one thing that's always been exported. Number 2 is raw materials. And we heard that the climate change is driving a lot of shipping. I would say that raw materials is driving a lot of shipping. So one example is this. What you see here is bulk carrier traffic on the coast of Greenland and Canada, and is by the Mary River mine in Nunavut, which is an iron mine in 2014. So what you see is the orange is the shipping, and then suddenly a mine opens, and this is the bulk carrier shipping happening. So suddenly there's a lot more ship traffic due to a natural resource that needs to go into global markets. So this is someone, probably in Europe or in the US, asking for a natural resource like iron, and it has to be transported somewhere. So that's definitely driving a lot of traffic as well. And then energy is being transported as well. I put this guy in because the first energy that was really exported from the Arctic was whale oil. So we used to take whale oil from the north and use that to lit up street lamps of Paris and Berlin and London. Then later it became oil and gas and so on. And talking about oil and gas, again, 2014, this is the amount of ship tracks according to Payne in 2014. And then we go up to 2024 and suddenly we see a lot of gas being carried, primarily on the Northern Sea Route, as we also heard from the previous speaker. That's really where a lot of the action is happening at the moment. This is also being impacted by sanctions, very slow but steady. So the last 2 years, Europe has imported record numbers of LNG from the Russian Arctic, primarily imported to Belgium and France. But it's just increasing. We see some companies like Gazprom looking more to China now, which will change the shipping patterns, but we still see Europe importing Russian LNG coming from the Arctic. We already saw this one from the previous speakers, but just to put it into context, yes, there is a lot more ships increasing in the Arctic region, very much driven by climate change, by natural resources, tourism, defense, dual use, research vessels as well. We have to remember that some of this is climate change research being done, but there's definitely an increase of shipping. There's also an increase in unique ships, just the same crafts, but a different way of showing it. But there's also the distance sailed. So this has an impact, for example, on noise pollution in the waters for the whales, which is a big issue. Danish shipping just came out with a policy paper on encouraging their members to be careful when sailing in Arctic waters, not to hit whales. So that's also an issue we don't often think about, but apparently there's a big damage to whales. And there's a lot, the distance being sailed in the Arctic is increasing, also because there's less sea ice. So what is driving some of all this development? We already heard about climate change and security. Trade is definitely driving a lot of the development. A lot of it is actually related to this graph from the United Nations. So in 2050, we'll be 9.7 billion people on this planet. And most of them will live inside of this circle than outside. So there are more people living inside of this circle than outside of this circle. These people, they need seafood, they need energy, hydrogen in the future, oil and gas maybe right now, and they need raw materials. So a lot of the shipping comes from the Arctic and goes into this circle. Number 2 is the key driver, as we heard from the previous 2 speakers, is the increasing temperatures. So in the Arctic region, temperatures rise 4 times as fast as anywhere else. Actually, around Svalbard is 7 times the global average. So temperature is really changing the amount of sea ice. On the Canadian side, on the north west passage, it actually doesn't make much difference for shipping. A research paper just came out that there will still be choke points at the most critical points. So even though the ice will melt, it will still block a lot of the shipping around Canada. But it will definitely change also the kind of ships we have, whether it's ice-breaking ships, so those are the red lines, or if it's regular ships. And it will, you see in here, this is the Central Arctic Ocean. There's also talks about there will be more fisheries here, and we also talked about more goods being transported because you will save CO2 emissions. Let's say that we're in a different geopolitical situation than today. You will be able to save a lot of CO2 emissions sailing from the northern part of Asia into Europe, for example, to Rotterdam, going through the Central Arctic Ocean. And it might be regular ships as well, which might make a difference. But just to say that it will change the kind of shipping we will see most likely, and this is from PAIM as well. And then the third one, which is the increasing tension. So this is related to the geopolitical issues we talked about. Everyone talks about the Northern Sea Route for many years. 2.5 years ago, it was seen as I remember I was at a meeting in Arkangel 6-7 years ago when all the foreign ministers of the Nordic regions were meeting with President Putin, shaking hands, and they were all talking about the Northern Sea Route. Maersk also did a test sailing there in 2018 to test if there was really a big potential. Then a war in Ukraine happens, and that also changes the amount of shipping. So what you see here is transit cargo and ships. Actually, this one up here is probably the best one. This is the amount of ships sailing on the Northern Sea Route, on the Northeast Passage. Just to put it into context, Panama Canal is around 12,000 ships passing through the Panama Canal. And this is 43 ships passed through the Northern Sea Route last year. So we have 12,000 ships going through the Panama Canal, and then we got 43 ships last year going on the Northern Sea Route. And this is obviously, you see the drop is obviously related to the wars and the sanctions. Right now, we are seeing Chinese container ships trying to sail there, but we also see very early sea ice. So it's very difficult to predict what will happen in the coming years. And then I just finally want to talk about some barriers, because there are some barriers for all of this. One is infrastructure. So the Russian Arctic is investing heavily in their infrastructure on the Northern Sea Route, but this also goes for Greenland. Greenland is investing in deep sea ports. There will be a new airport, new airstrip ready in Greenland in November. That's also going to change shipping in many ways. So infrastructure. We need better infrastructure also for search and rescue. I just spoke with Innovation South Greenland. They are doing an exercise in southern Greenland in a few weeks where they will test what will happen if a cruise ship of 3,000 people sinks outside the coast of Greenland. Do they have enough beds? Do they have enough facilities to house people? This is also infrastructure in many, many ways. Number 2, barriers both for shipping and also economic growth generally in the Arctic is investments. There's a lot of people who says we should stop shipping in the Arctic, we should stop investing in the Arctic, which is very much people not living in the Arctic saying this. It's very hard to find people living in the Arctic saying no to shipping in the Arctic, even for indigenous groups. So this is a barrier that we don't get enough investments because those of us living in the Arctic has become the poster boy for climate change. And then the main barrier is lack of people. We are just 4 million people living in the Arctic. That's also why a lot of the shipping is relevant for people outside the Arctic region. We are just 4 million people living inside the Arctic region. We have space for more, so you're more than welcome to move up north. And this also relates to the final point, which I have, and this is related to the people's point. And it was on Lin's slide as well, that it takes skills and competences to sail in the Arctic. So there's the polar code area, the Arctic polar code area. So this is an area, what you see here and up here. Within this area, there's special regulation. special regulations when it comes to equipment you need to have on the ship, special regulations when it comes to design and construction of the vessel, and more importantly, special regulation when it comes to operations and manning, because it's not standard operating procedure to sail in the Arctic. It takes special skills, and the IMO introduced the Polar Code. They are looking to update it right now. I think it's from 2017, and is already outdated now, for example, because of green shipping. So no one ever considered what would ammonia or e-methanol, what impact would it have on the Polar Code area. But just to say there's different regulations here. And with that, I'm looking forward to the question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mads. Thank you, all three speakers. If you want to step on to the stage, we'll take some questions. I'm going to abuse my right, as is custom, as chair, to ask the first question. Some of you mentioned indigenous people just briefly, and I'm wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on to what extent sort of indigenous communities are engaged, relied upon, asked, ignored, seen from your different perspectives. So, for example, in terms of new regulation or implementing regulation in terms of knowledge about the ice, and in terms of, for example, infrastructure, Mads, your point. So yeah, maybe we'll take that question and then we'll open up the floor.
Should I start with the legal? Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. So that's actually a very good question, and it's a big issue that also came up in my research, because indigenous peoples are, of course, very much, as you already mentioned, affected by shipping, by trade, and so much in the Arctic, more than others who don't live in the Arctic. But they have difficulties in making their voice heard in international law arenas. Not so much in the Arctic Council. So what I heard from my interviews was that they're quite happy with their role in the Arctic Council, where they are have this position as permanent participants and have full consultation rights. But it does look different in the IMO. So in the IMO, we actually only have one group of indigenous people. So we have the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which before that was always participating as part of environmental NGOs delegations. But of course then they are kind of bound by that agenda and couldn't share their own. But in 2021, they gained provisional consultative status for the first time, which meant that they also now have the power to put things onto the agenda, to make submissions and so on. And they have been actively doing that. They have been quite involved in the regulation of black carbon emissions from Arctic shipping, at least. And they also note, what Matthew also mentioned already, is that any regulation that is taken should take into account that any adverse economic impacts are not passed down to the local and indigenous communities, but that should be internalized at a higher level. So yeah, that's from the legal side.
I think so. Just for those of you that are not Arctic experts, so the indigenous peoples are 10% of the Arctic region, 11% according to the Arctic Council, and it differs very much where you are. And that also, the answer will differ where you are. So let's take, for example, in Russia, you got Raypon, which is a group of indigenous peoples. They are observers to the PP, permanent participants of the Arctic Council, and they have been working on several projects. They want to export their reindeer meat to global markets. So they're interested in investments on the Northern Sea route. And they are definitely being hit by sanctions right now, which means it's less difficult for indigenous peoples to get their products out to markets. Then you got ICC, for example. They are negotiating on the Central Arctic Ocean's Fisheries Agreement, which is an agreement about what will happen when the ice melts on the Central Arctic Ocean. This is Russia, China, US, European Union, Iceland, Norway, South Korea, and Japan are negotiating what will happen when the ice melts on the Central Arctic Ocean, and ICC is a part of these negotiations. I also think it's interesting sometimes if you look at the heavy fuel oil ban, for example, one of the strongest opponents was Royal Arctic Line, which is a Greenlandic state-owned company. So Greenland is 95% indigenous. So is that an indigenous voice or is it not an indigenous voice? I think sometimes it's difficult to see, is it the indigenous voice? Are we talking only about the PPs here, or are we talking about the people living there. So just to say, there's no easy answers. One of the big ones, though, is noise pollution and the hunting grounds and whaling and so on. So the more traditional indigenous peoples are worried about increased shipments, for example. So that's something that is being looked at. So there's no easy answers to that.
The geopolitical perspective. I think there's no doubt that indigenous knowledge, local knowledge of sea ice and navigating through sea ice and on sea ice is very important, and it's something that you can't replace with other kinds of knowledge. But I agree with your point that it's sometimes difficult to distinguish between indigenous and local populations, and I think, most important for Denmark and for the Kingdom of Denmark is, of course, the relation to Greenland. And I think here a very concrete issue in terms of maritime security and dynamics in the ocean is critical infrastructure, including sea cables, because that's something that very directly affects the everyday life of people in Greenland. That Greenland is only connected by 2 sea cables. So if there's a breakdown, it has a lot of effects. And 2 colleagues have written an excellent DIIS brief about this. So some advertising there.
Great, thanks. All right, we'll be passing around a microphone. So if you could please state your name and any institutional affiliation. And then, we'll take a couple of questions.
Please open the laptop lid, because I have a specific question to
one of the maps.
One of your slides.
Yeah, please.
I saw a blue line coming from the Canadian High Arctic, or Baffin Island maybe, going down to Baffin Bay and Davis Strait. What ship line was that?
There's a lot of it is
and the slide read gas.
So there's the gas. If you take it, is the further up. So the maps are from PAIM, and I cannot tell you exactly what ship lines it is. So PAIM comes out, and I'm sure the other 2 speakers will agree, with an excellent report. It's really, really good, and it has all the numbers and all the details. So wait, this one?
Yeah, probably that one.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. I wish I could answer it, but I will refer to my friends in PAIM who does this research, and you can actually go in and click on the data as well and get details about the data. There's also the Center for High North Logistics located in Kirkenes that does the same research. Okay. So I cannot answer you straight away, but it is from the PAIM website. Okay. I didn't draw it myself.
And one more comment to one of your other statements. Yep. I know we can blame Gazprom for a lot, but we cannot blame them for LNG export to Europe.
Pipeline.
But it's Novatek who is operating the Yamal LNG terminal. Just for clarification.
Yes, Novatek, and they are exporting to Europe, but Gazprom is also also business in the Arctic, and they are also exporting gas to China. I will be happy to show you this with.
You were talking about export to Europe.
Yeah, that's Novatek. Used to be Gazprom.
Nitty gritty.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
Thank you. Now that we are talking about the sea routes, what is the insurance part of this? Because of course all the pros and cons, but I've also read that certain insurance companies do not allow shipping companies to take this route. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Maybe I can just start and then let the 2 legal experts comment on this as well. So it was interesting. I was speaking with a Chinese shipping company, and they actually said that they were staying away. So this is Costco. They were staying away from the Northern Sea route because their insurance comes from Lloyd's of London. So since their insurance is located in London, they have to pick: should I either ship to the whole world, minus the Northern Sea route, or should I just go for the Northern Sea route and I will lose my insurance for the rest of the world? So actually there, just the issues around insurance plays a big deal. A lot of the shipping happening right now, they don't really care much about insurance on the Northern Sea route. That's the big issue. There's a lot of spoofing as well going on, which also has an impact. But insurance is a big issue. There is an organization called Pole Arctic that is trying to change the area for insurance, because you also pay a premium if you go inside the Arctic. And the definition of where to pay a premium was decided from sea charts from 1976, and the oceans has changed a lot since then. So there's already an extra burden put on some companies sailing in the Arctic, and an insurance premium. But yes, it has an impact of who is allowed to sail on the Northern Sea route. I don't know if
I don't think I'm a legal expert, so
I'm a legal expert, but I'm a public international legal expert, and that's more on the private law side, so I don't have much to add there. But it is something that I'm looking into more in my project that I'm employed at now, which looks at transition risks in the decarbonization of shipping in general. So insurance is, of course, something that we will look at it as well, but for now, I don't have much that I can contribute.
We'll stay tuned on that.
Yes. And I also had a question, if I could ask.
Yes, sure.
I was wondering if you could share a bit more on the sanctions and how they affect Arctic shipping specifically, if you have more to share.
I think personally, there's on shipyards, I think is very interesting when it comes to sanctions. So I live in North Norway, and there's in Kirkenes on the border to Russia, 42 kilometers away, there was a famous shipyard called Qvist. And Qvist, 80% of their staffers were from Russia, because it was cheaper to get Russian staffers to work in the shipyards in Norway. And when the war happened, suddenly that was a close for business. This is an area that had a pandemic, which also meant there were less cruise ships sailing up there. And then there was the war, suddenly means that there's also less cruise ships that dare to sail close to Russia. So the cruise ships would normally go around Kirkenes and then will go into Russia briefly and then back again. So that has an impact on this community of 3,500 people. When it comes to sanctions overall, I think we've seen, if you read the news, you see a lot about spoofing, ships suddenly having an extra chimney or changing their name, and that's a challenge when it comes to the sanctions regime. Luckily, we have companies like KSAT, for example, that are tracking ships' vessels using satellites. And that is helping a little bit, but it's very, very hard to control this. Like, the sanctions regime is difficult, especially in remote Arctic communities. I think there was the case, if we go to the Kingdom of the Faroe Islands, when a Russian fishing vessel comes in and wants to have a service, for example, they have an engine problem, are you allowed to service them? That depends on the final ownership of that ship. So now you're suddenly asking the local electrician in a small town in Faroe Islands to know the EU and US sanction regulations. This is extremely complex and difficult. So I think actually it has a massive impact. For the bigger shipping liners, it's less of an issue. Okay, maybe not for Russia. Russia is struggling to get technology, but for Western companies, it's less of an issue.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. I saw a hand. Yeah, so we have 2 hands here.
Thank you. My name is Peter Linde. I come from the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I have a question to Stella about how do you see the most effective way to reduce black carbon? And we're talking about legal incentives. Are we talking about which forum is the most proper to negotiate in? Is it the IMO? Is it something with the Arctic states? Do you want to get the indigenous communities involved? What would be the most effective instrument? Where to negotiate it, and on which terms? You do have all the pieces, but in your mind, what would be the most effective way forward to reduce black carbon in the Arctic?
Yes.
So maybe just take one more question.
Hello, my name is Miao and I'm from Navigational Capital, which is a ship owner's office. I have a question for Mads. For the Northern Sea route, before it can become a meaningful alternative for the global shipping routes, there are many barriers, as the speakers have mentioned. I remember looking into one research work many years ago, and there it mentioned that because majority of the shipping routes lies within the Russian territory. So I think the Russian government, you need to get permits from the government, you need to have Russian-speaking pilots on board, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of sort of on that side. I wonder if you could say a few more words on that, whether there's new developments. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Stella, do you want to start?
Yes, could I ask you to actually pull up my slides?
Technology. It's is it open?
It's open, yeah.
Yeah.
It says
This
Stella. Yes. So I didn't delve into this, but in my thesis I do go through all of the different options that exist for regulating black carbon as well. They're quite technical. So some relate to, a fuel switch, some relate to adopting an aromatic standard for fuels. There are also issues related to speed reduction that also affects black carbon emissions, the designation of emission control areas, and so on. And basically, I mean, again, this is just my personal opinion. You asked about my personal opinion. So having talked to all the actors that are involved and having read the legal documents from 2011 until now, I do think the IMO should be the forum to go for, because that is where everything has happened until now. We have it still on the agenda. For now, the final date for that, I think, is 2025. Of course, that will be pushed back again. But the IMO, I think, is the relevant forum, also because we do have most of the actors involved there, and they have been able to contribute. And we have so much knowledge there, even though, of course, more can come from the Arctic Council. And I think, really, as this is so important to regulate now, I think the most effective, like you said, way to go for would be to transform the voluntary fuel switch resolution that we already have into a mandatory one. Because that doesn't require any new engine measures or any retrofitting or anything. The ships already make the switch from heavy fuel oil to distillates in other areas of the world. You don't need to. You don't need no fuels. You don't need any engine measures. It's something that you can do overnight if you make that resolution mandatory. And then again later you can continue with some more measures. You can mandate the installation of after treatment technologies such as, for example, diesel particulate filters to get even more black carbon absorbed. So that would then be, I think, about 90%. But I think the most effective and first step that can happen actually overnight is to have the mandatory fuel switch resolution at the IMO. Yeah. That would be great.
If you can solve that, I will be impressed. That's it's a big issue.
I will send my PhD summary to everyone that I've spoken to. So I'm trying my best.
To answer the question on the Northern Sea route, so if you go back, let's say 2.5 years ago, there was a greater interest on the Northern Sea route, and the Russian government was investing a lot in the infrastructure along the route. And there, it did have a high cost, a high price to sail on it. You needed the pilots on, etc. Now they're a little bit more relaxed, because now they're desperate to get anyone to sail there. So it's considerably cheaper, and there is a Chinese, no one really knows the ownership, but it's registered in China, a container vessel called New Shipping. So New Shipping is increasing their shipments on container shipping on the Northern Sea route. And we don't know officially, but some people are saying they might get a good discount to do this. So it should be cheaper. Doesn't mean it's less risky. The Russian government just announced yesterday that they are building yet another nuclear icebreaker, one of the largest nuclear icebreakers, because they want to be able to pave the way throughout for whole year shipping. Right now, you mainly sail there in the summer season. But they are desperate to get their energy out, to get the raw materials out, and to get increased shipping on the route. So yes, it's not cheap at the moment. It's long-term planning. COSCO used to sail there. COSCO is not sailing there so much anymore. So the answer is the Russian government is trying a lot, but it is costly.
Thank you. There is a follow-up question over here.
By the way, I'm Mads Christensen. I'm a senior energy advisor for many, many years. Back in the days, I was also a consultant for the Greenland Home Rule, and one of the things we were dealing with was the so-called Arctic Pilot Project about shipping LNG from the Canadian High Arctic to Eastern Canada or to Europe. One of the aspects which the Danish and Greenland opposition was centered about was noise pollution in the air. in the seaboard. I don't see noise on that list of bullets. Is it built in the speed reduction or engine certification?
Yeah.
Is noise an issue here in 2024? It was a big issue in 1982, 83, and 84.
At the IMO. Oh,
Sorry, can
we're
we just take
taking
one
another.
more?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Sorry.
Good afternoon, Bjarke Bøtzer from Industry Association Danish Maritime. I have remark regarding the black carbon, and then also a question regarding the icebreakers. And my remark would be that I think it's necessary not only to look into the easy solutions, which would be, as you just stipulated, that the voluntary ban would become mandatory, but you should also look into the available technologies where actually some of our members that produce exhaust gas treatment systems claim that the exhaust gas after being through a so-called scrubber is cleaner than if you sail on the fuel which are allowed, the so-called clean fuels. So I mean, if you want to really to protect the environment, one should look into the available technologies. Having said that, it's not an easy field. So that was my remark. Then regarding the icebreakers, I mean, it was very interesting, but what I perhaps missed was an overview of how many icebreakers are there, which nations have them, and which icebreaker projects are in the pipeline. And also, I think there was no remark about Denmark having no icebreakers. And if we look at the amount of territory that we are currently responsible for and possibly will become responsible for in the future, since we have claimed to gain new territories around the North Pole. What, in your view, does this mean for icebreaker capacity? And then maybe just to round up with another remark, because you mentioned the icebreaker partnership or ice pact. And I personally would have liked to see Denmark taking part in that, because we have the companies that can do the engine technologies for that, and we also have design houses that actually have experience in designing some of the new icebreakers. And then, of course, not least, we have a lot of territory to protect. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. Shall we start with Lin and then Stella?
Sure. Start with the icebreakers. There is an overview of the number of icebreakers in the world. I think it's from 2017, unless it's been updated, and it's from the US, I think the Coast Guard. And the way they count icebreakers is interesting, because according to that chart, I think Denmark has 8. So that's just to say that what is an icebreaker is not, an exact science. Depends on whether you count ice-enforced ships as well. So I think, I don't really want to expose you to some kind of overview that's perhaps not accurate. And that's part of my point, is that it's difficult to count icebreakers, and depending on what kind of argument you want to make, for example, to Congress, you can make it look like Russia has more icebreakers than they actually do, if you ask other people. Why doesn't Denmark or the Kingdom of Denmark have an icebreaker? I think we used to. We used to have 4. We have a research ship on the way. I think it's DTU. I don't know if they own it or if they will just manage it. But I guess, in the broad view of the defense agreement, I'm not sure icebreakers are top of the list, and I'm not sure we can afford it, to be honest, because there's a lot of stuff to already repair in and around Nuuk. The ships we already have. On top of that, there's dynamics around the Faroe Islands and a whole kind of Baltic area priorities there to take into account. So I guess if we had all the money in the world, probably we would have icebreakers. I'm not sure I buy the argument about if we get this huge or part of this huge area in the Arctic Ocean north of Greenland, then we need icebreakers for that, because that whole negotiation is not about the sea column or the water column. It's about the seabed only, and it's not about sovereignty. It's about sovereign rights. I don't know if you or maybe some of your colleagues have, distinction between what is sovereignty versus sovereign rights. But that whole UNCLOS negotiation is not about the water column itself. You might still need an icebreaker, but it's not going to be Kingdom of Denmark territory in that sense.
No, just very briefly on the icebreakers, because there is a very good poster that was just published by a shipyard called Aker in Finland, where you can see all icebreakers in the world, and they are even struggling to update it because it depends on what ice classes. And Russia has one ice class, Europe has another ice class, and North America has a third ice class. So even if you're a shipping company, there's not one definition. Though there was announced 2 weeks ago that Sweden and Finland is going together to build an icebreaker, which is both for research and also subsea fiber optic cable, the Nordic Connect cable. So Finland and Sweden is working together on this. There's the Ice Pact, obviously, and the kingdom could have joined that. I'm not sure if the North Americans were interested in it because it really came from the US saying we need to build our own icebreakers, build American, and they went to Mississippi because they owed someone some favors. And now they ask a shipyard that has never built an icebreaker in their life to build an icebreaker. And then, obviously, as we saw, it's very delayed. So now they have actually leased an icebreaker as a backup. The Canadians have done another genius model similar to the super hospitals in Denmark. So they got 2 different shipyards to build 2 icebreakers, different designs, different shipyards, but at the same time. So both of them are delayed and over time and over budget. What the challenge here is that Russia and China right now is sailing over to Alaska with their icebreakers just to show off. And the Americans had to bring one of the icebreakers up there, and had just been on fire, the engine, Healy. So they were struggling to get up there in time. So from a security perspective, it's a show of force. But do we really need it other than a show of force? That's the question. And then is it Arctic command ships? Could we use those instead? So there's the whole debate of why would you need an icebreaker from the kingdom? And I think really partnerships would make the most sense. Find countries that has the same interest. And then, yes, we could use Danish shipyards to build it, but it's expensive. Then you have the noise pollution.
You want to yes, so actually I really appreciate you bringing in the topic of noise pollution and sharing your perspective that it was already a very high topic on the agenda a long time ago, which is also a bit depressing because it is still a topic on the agenda at the IMO. It hasn't been resolved. And it really came in big again after 2021 when the ICC, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, gained consultative status, and they have really been vocal, and they're also the ones, as you picked up upon who introduced or who are in favor of the speed reduction, because that is actually one of the measures or one of the few measures that also impacts noise pollution, but they haven't found a lot of support for that measure, so I don't think it will be likely that that will get adopted at the IMO. So yeah, there are some guidelines at the IMO regarding noise pollution that have also been revised recently. I haven't followed the negotiations myself, so I know that there's stuff happening, but at least in connection to black carbon emissions, I don't think that is where the solution will be found, unfortunately. And then regarding the what you mentioned as well, that is also a big issue, this whole air pollution, turning an air pollution problem into a marine environmental problem, because a lot of actors that are using heavy fuel oil are saying, okay, but what if we can just continue to use heavy fuel oil and use scrubbers? But like you said, that then actually turns it into a marine environment problem. But that is actually not what I was referring to with the switch to distillate fuels, because that would mean a switch to diesel and then using diesel particulate filters, which would not be the same as using heavy fuel oil and scrubbers. So just to clarify that. Yes.
Excellent. Any further questions? Or maybe I can insert myself then. So we already heard from the Foreign Ministry here in Denmark. I know there are representatives from government, not only Danish ministries, but also embassies. Is this me? No. Okay. Also embassies here in Copenhagen that are, I'm sure, taking notes and reporting back to their respective capitals. So from what you've been talking about today and seen from your work and research, what is the main question or issue to be addressed to keep the Arctic we speak about exceptionalism in the Arctic, right, which is a little bit difficult these days. But to keep it a low tension, peaceful, and sustainable region. Broad question, so you can go anywhere you want.
Yes. I think from at least the research that I've been doing, what keeps coming up again and again to overcome the barriers that I mentioned, to avoid conflicts or overcome conflicts, is to have more collaboration amongst the different actors. So amongst the different state actors, which of course we're focusing on today, more the geopolitical sides, but also amongst non-state actors, which I only briefly mentioned, to enhance collaboration and alliances between environmental NGOs, with indigenous peoples, with industry, with Arctic states, to kind of see where are common issues that we can work together on to overcome these conflicts and have a more prosperous future.
Lin?
Should I go next? Okay. How to keep the Arctic peaceful? If I knew the answer, I think I would have a slightly different job. But I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind. First is that this sometimes we talk about maintaining low tension. I think that ship has sailed. I think we need to talk about returning to low tension and that kind of thing. And maybe it's just a wording thing, but I do think it's important to kind of talk about where are we starting from. And the Arctic today, I think, looks very different than it did pre-2022 and also pre-2014. Of course, I think the Arctic Council is very important, even if it's not functioning as it should be at the moment. Just having the Arctic Council as a forum that's functioning kind of low level, I think is very important because it's such an important mechanism and an agenda set up for the whole region. Then I think we also need to talk more about and be aware of how these security dynamics are becoming part of everything. My PhD project is about science and scientific efforts in the Arctic, and I get to follow climate scientists around a lot as they research climate change in the Arctic. And security, in some ways, and geopolitics have always been part of that knowledge production, but it's definitely not decreasing in the way it's kind of becoming part of also scientific efforts. And I think in line with that, something I actually oppose a little bit is the idea of science diplomacy, because I think, first of all, sometimes it's kind of very vague what we mean by that, but I also think it risks asking scientists to be diplomats, and we don't ask diplomats to be scientists. So I'm not saying there isn't a fruitful kind of debate to be had there, but I think we should be very careful to sort of push scientists in front of us to solve geopolitical issues.
Good point.
No, it's very good answers from the other two, and just to say, the conflict is already in the Arctic. We had two drone attacks from Ukrainian drones attacking an air base in Murmansk just a few months ago in the Arctic. So we already have the conflict in Ukraine is already taking place in the Arctic. So how can we go back, as we heard from Lin? That's the question. And I think here is really the focus on the triple use, not even dual use, but looking at, first of all, investing in the people living there. I think there was for many years a neglect of people that goes for the kingdom, but that goes for anywhere else in the Arctic as well. So investing in those people, so that's investing in infrastructures, giving them a reason to stay in the region, because the moment that people are leaving the region, that's someone else will fill that vacuum. So if you have a peaceful build-up of thriving communities, so investing in people is really, and to do that, you need the infrastructure development. And then we have to remember also where we are succeeding. So search and rescue, we are still working with Russia, and the US Coast Guard is still working with Russia on search and rescue. The Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, which is sustainable fisheries and research, is still happening with Russia and China and the US and the EU. So we are still, doing things. But we cannot be naive about it. So we have the largest investments in Norway at the moment is happening in defense, and the largest sum of this defense spending will take place in the northern part of Norway. So they will create 3 new brigades, and 2 of them will be well above the Arctic Circle. So we need to both invest in defense, because we neglected that. We need to invest in the people and the infrastructure, and then we need to look at where do we still have collaboration. Arctic Council, another one, and not give up on that. So.
Thanks. We do have time for one more question if anyone has something. Right. Well, in that case, I would like to thank our 3 panelists very much for coming here today and sharing their work and research with us. And to the rest of you, stay tuned for our next seminar on maritime security in January. And thank you very much for coming. And let's give the panelists a round of applause.